Shalom and welcome to Israel Policy Pod. I'm your host, Shanie Reichman, the Director of Strategic Initiatives and of IPF Atid at Israel Policy Forum. And I'm joined here by Neri Zilber, a journalist based in Tel Aviv and policy advisor at Israel Policy Forum. Hi, Neri.
Hi, Shanie. It's good to be back with you. I don't know what the weather is like in New York, but it's been frigid here in Tel Aviv. Very East Coast, Northeastern winter vibes the last few days here, as I'm sure you've heard.
So everyone in New York has been talking about how warm it is, but it's probably approximately the same temperature as it is in Tel Aviv. It's in the 40s. For us, that's really warm. Fahrenheit. That's probably what you're looking at. Cold. Yeah. So I think we have the same temperature, but it's all about perspective.
It's all about perspective, indeed.
We're going to cover today the hostage releases, ceasefire deal, operations and tensions brewing in the West Bank, and we'll kind of take it from there. It has been a very hectic week in Israel. We are extremely grateful for the 6 living hostages who came back home to Israel on Saturday, including Avera Mengistu and Hisham al-Sayed, who were held hostage for over a decade in Hamas captivity. But that was unfortunately sort of overshadowed by the enormous tragedy that our community faced. It was quite heartbreaking last week when we received the news that 85-year-old Oded Lifshitz and babies Kfir and Ariel and their mother Shiri Bibas were all killed while in Hamas captivity in Gaza. Their bodies were returned home in a really grotesque public ceremony, which is also in violation of the ceasefire hostage agreement. And even worse, Hamas initially sent the wrong body in Shiri's place before finally sending her home to Israel. Neri, you've spent many months or almost years now, I'm speaking with hostage families. What is the national mood in Israel with Oded's funeral today and the Bibas family funeral coming up tomorrow?
Well, you put your finger on it, Shanie. Very difficult week here in Israel, almost bipolar, I would dare say. So obviously there were the days late last week when the deceased hostages, the murdered hostages were released and returned home, although in Shiri Bibas' case, it was delayed. I don't think on purpose, frankly, but it was delayed nonetheless, and they sent back the wrong body of a Palestinian woman, unidentified, and not Shiri Bibas. So we, and especially the Bibas family, had to endure, I think another 24, 36 hours of waiting to see if they could locate the body and return her home for a proper burial, which will be happening tomorrow down in Neri. So you had that in terms of the end of the week. And then on Saturday, like you said, we had 6 living hostages, thankfully all living, all in okay condition. We'll say okay condition. Although in the case of Avera and Hisham, they seem to be in quite difficult emotional states, especially Hisham, according to everything his family has said publicly. And like you said, they've been in Gaza for a decade. So obviously not a easy situation, but everyone was very thankful that they also were included in this overall hostage and ceasefire deal. So yes, everyone rejoiced on Saturday, and then depending on the day, the mood swings. So today, and we're speaking on Tuesday night, Tel Aviv time, Oded Lifshitz was laid to rest, also in Neri. And his funeral was broadcast live this afternoon, along with the eulogies. So quite moving eulogies, not only by Israeli President Bougie Herzog and other dignitaries, but his family, including his grandchildren and, in one case, his great-granddaughter. And it was quite something. And we'll hopefully get into it in just a second. So today it was Oded Lifshitz laid to rest, and he had this funeral procession from central Israel down south to the Gaza border. And tomorrow, I dare say it'll be even more difficult because it's one thing to lay to rest a grandfather and great-grandfather. It's quite another to lay to rest a mother and her 4-year-old and 10-month-old infant. So I think tomorrow will be very, very difficult. And as I'm sure you know very well, Shanie, and our listeners know, this was, I dare say, an emotional turning point for many people here in Israel and many people watching on across the world. Just the visceral anger and disgust at Hamas and whoever other terrorists in the Gaza Strip abducted Shiri and Kfir and Ariel and murdered them. In the Gaza Strip, we'll go with Hamas because they're ultimately responsible for October 7th and everything that's happened afterwards. And yes, it struck people very, very strongly. I can say even cynical, jaded, and faded journalists who have been covering this war from the very first minute, including myself in this, and I'm speaking from obviously personal experience. We've interviewed hostage families. We've interviewed families of those killed on October 7th, civilians and soldiers. We've done a lot over the past 16 months. I personally wasn't prepared for the emotions when Shiri and Kfir and Ayel were returned. I think that's telling. So tomorrow I think will be quite difficult, but it is good that they're home, especially for Yarden Bibas, the father, who was also released earlier this month. He has some semblance of closure to this horrible, horrible nightmare, and that's putting it mildly. Hopefully he and the family can gain some small comfort from that.
And I know the entire Jewish community abroad is obviously feeling similarly. I would use the word reeling, perhaps, to describe how people are feeling emotionally. Now,
yeah, and no. I mean, this isn't a minor point. I think it's two things, right? I think number one, and I've interviewed members of the Bibas family as well as members of the Lifshitz family, and there's always a hope, right? Up until the very last moment that they're still alive and that they would still be alive and come home. And even with Dead Lifshitz family, I spoke to them when the ceasefire first started, 5-6 weeks ago. They were realistic because Dead Lifshitz, an older man, pre-existing medical conditions, it would have been difficult for him to survive 16 months in a Hamas tunnel. But still, they were hopeful but realistic, as well as the Bibas family. And look, we journalists were told and heard very early on that the prospects for Shiri and the kids coming home were not great, and that they were very likely no longer alive. Now, it's one thing to kind of understand that intellectually, journalistically, professionally, and even for the families, always, okay, they can understand that, and they knew that, but still, the hope was there. And it's quite another thing to see a coffin in the Gaza Strip being paraded around with the pictures of Israeli babies on them. And so I think that's a shift, right? So that struck people very, very strongly, who all obviously were watching it unfold. And then the bodies had to be taken to Abu Kabir, the big pathology headquarters outside of Tel Aviv, and they had to identify the bodies and confirm that it was actually them. And in Shiri's case, it wasn't her. So I think for many people that struck them very strongly. And then just the manner, second point, the manner in which the Bibas family were killed. And I'm not going to get into details, but even IDF spokesman Daniel Hagari said they weren't killed in an IDF airstrike. They weren't killed by bullets. They were killed via the bare hands of their terrorist captors. And so I think the sheer brutality and viciousness of this entire saga shocked people. I mean, I don't know if we're even able to be shocked given what we all know and saw with regard to October 7th itself. But 16 months later, it brought everything back in a real way. And I think those 2 points really, like you said, caused a lot of people to reel back in horror and disgust. And we shouldn't sugarcoat it. I'm sure you've heard similar sentiments as I have, Shanie. People are very angry, not only towards Hamas, but towards the entire Gaza Strip. Here in Israel, you have everyone from senior government ministers to cab drivers and shopkeepers and people that may or may not send you a WhatsApp message saying one word and one word only: revenge. And I don't think that's quite a healthy emotion sentiment. I understand where they're coming from, but that's not a healthy either personal plan or, and especially a national plan and a policy to move forward with.
Let's start talking about the prospects for bringing home more hostages, ideally alive, of course, and also the bodies of those killed home to Israel. The first phase of the ceasefire hostage deal, I would say, went, rather successfully in the sense that those who were meant to come home throughout the deal were actually brought back to Israel. But of course, the second phase is much, much trickier to achieve. And right now we are at potentially an impasse with Israel not releasing the 600 prisoners that they are meant to be releasing from prison at the moment. So what is coming next for us? What do you think is going to happen in terms of either extending the first phase or moving on, hopefully, to a second phase? I'm also curious what you think the role is of the U.S. in all of this, because I know they're trying to get involved, of course.
So this is the big question of the day, and I think this podcast will likely go out on Wednesday. So by then, I think my article for the Financial Times on this very issue, Shanie, should be published. So I urge people to press stop and then go subscribe to the Financial Times and then read my article. But no, in all seriousness,
love the pitch.
Yeah. Get it in there. But definitely, Financial Times subscription, I hear, is very expensive. So just reach out and I'll send you the article. The millions of our listeners, I'll send it to each and every one of you, I promise. So let's break this up. There's a small crisis, there's a bigger crisis, potentially, and then there's the kind of U.S. role in all of this. So small crisis dates back to this past weekend. As I'm sure our listeners may be aware of, Hamas, not only as part of the deal, they obviously released 6 Israeli hostages, all living. Israel was supposed to release over 600 Palestinian prisoners on Saturday, in lieu of the Hamas releases. And Israel decided to delay the release of those 600 prisoners, many of them convicted terrorists. And so for the past few days, they've been trying to find some formulation and some agreement to not only get those 600 Palestinian prisoners indeed released, but also we have upcoming on Thursday the expected release of 4 more, unfortunately deceased Israeli hostages from captivity. And that will kind of conclude the first stage of the Gaza ceasefire deal. Now, the hope is that even before Thursday, potentially some kind of agreement can be reached and we can successfully conclude this first stage. And I remember, I think you and I spoke about the deal when it was first signed, I think that very night, Shanie. And I think I had shortly thereafter a podcast with our friends Michael and Shira, and there was a whole debate about whether the first stage would actually run to completion. And I think there were differences of opinion, but I believe I was on the side of the argument that there were good reasons for both Israel and Hamas to fulfill their obligations and see out the 6 weeks and get 33 Israelis, and by the way, 5 Thai foreign workers out of captivity. And that's not a small thing at all. So hopefully with the 4 deceased hostages set to be released in the coming days, we're going to be left with 59 hostages still in captivity, less than half, by the way, alive. So that's also important to keep in mind, the ratio of hostages that are still alive, and we'll get to that in just a second. So if we can get through this mini crisis, then we have a looming bigger crisis this weekend, because the first stage is over. And I mentioned this at the top, the introduction of the episode last week, in my interview with Jonathan Dekelchen, the father of Sagi Dekelchen, the returned hostage, basically laying out the looming end of the first stage, and the fact that I think many people looking on have kind of grown accustomed to not only there being a ceasefire in Gaza, but also hostages coming out every week. And we may be sleepwalking into a potential crisis, because stage 2 negotiations, essentially talks over the next phase of the deal, haven't begun yet, despite the fact that the deal signed last month required the talks to have already begun 3 weeks ago. And that's a problem, and the clock is running out. I dare say maybe on Israel's part on purpose. That's, again, we'll shelve that for just a second as well. But the hope is, look, there's not going to be an agreement on the second stage in the next coming days, right? It's a heavy lift. And for those who don't know, second stage essentially means the release of at least all the remaining living hostages, over a dozen people, in return for Israel committing to essentially ending the war, withdrawing from Gaza, and then there are follow-on stages, potentially for reconstruction and so on and so forth. That's a massive lift, because as we all know, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is not willing to commit to ending the war. He's not willing to commit to ending the war. Again, you can call it a position of principle. You can also call it a position due to base politics, given the fact that people like Bezalel Smotrich and other far-right members of his governing coalition have threatened to topple the government if he ends the war and doesn't resume the fighting. So nevertheless, this is where we're at. Negotiations over the second stage have not started. You're unlikely to get an agreement in the coming days. And so the best that you can hope for is an extension of phase one. Now, the ceasefire may be able to hold for days and potentially a few weeks. And that's also in the original agreement, that if talks continue over stage two, that you can kind of extend the ceasefire and keep the truce going. The rub here is that Israel is demanding that if the ceasefire is extended past this weekend, that Hamas continue releasing hostages. So Israel wants to continue the weekly releases, and it's an open question whether Hamas will agree to that. It's an open question because at a certain point, the numbers may not add up for Hamas. That they may have some wiggle room in terms of the hostages that they're holding, but it's not an infinite number, thankfully. But that remains to be seen.
Do you mean to say they want to maintain some hostages for leverage?
Hamas knows that the hostages are its only insurance card against complete annihilation by Israel. It's the only leverage they have. So depending on Hamas's calculus, how much leverage do you need to keep the pressure on Israel? Is it 25 hostages, living hostages? Is it 15? Is it 10? And again, we're just talking about the live hostages. They also have over 30 hostages that we know are no longer alive. And again, that's also not a minor point. Israel, and especially all those families, want them home. They want them home, obviously. So the thinking amongst people that I've talked to, and again, I urge everyone to read the article that's coming out on Wednesday. The hope is that you can extend phase one, basically. So Netanyahu is going for phase 1+. You keep the ceasefire intact, at least for a couple of weeks. You get as many additional hostages out if Hamas agrees to play ball. And in the process of doing that, you engage in stage two negotiations, although still skeptical that Netanyahu would necessarily agree to permanently end the war. And that has a benefit both for Hamas and for Israel. For Hamas, Ramadan, the holy Muslim month, is starting this weekend as well. And so maybe Hamas, on behalf of the devastated people of Gaza, may want to hand them a peaceful Ramadan this year, unlike last year. And so maybe Hamas wants to at least extend the ceasefire for phase one for another few weeks and is willing to pay with the release of hostages. And for Israel, obviously it wants as many hostages back as possible. So it's trying to, again, pursue its leverage and its advantage over Hamas. And Israel, let's be clear, has threatened to restart the war if the ceasefire ends, and restart the war in a major way. I think I mentioned this in a recent pod. There are some people here in Israel, both on the political echelon and the security echelon, that want to see what fighting a war under President Donald Trump is like, and whether they can achieve better results on the battlefield and then by extension at the negotiating table under President Trump. Remains to be seen, but that's the thinking, and that's the at least hope in some quarters, that you can at least extend the ceasefire beyond this weekend and get more Israelis back home. And we should mention, Shanie, that every one of the hostages that have come home and every one of the hostage families, both of those who have returned and definitely those who have not had their loved ones released yet, are saying one thing consistently, sometimes mere minutes after they're returned home: Israel needs to agree to the second stage. There needs to be a second stage. And that if Netanyahu needs to commit to ending the war, that's the price that Israel needs to pay to get everyone back home. And that's a constant message from every one of the hostages and every one of their family members. And so we should definitely take that into account as this weekend looms, and as a potential crisis. Again, in the talks, but really over the Gaza ceasefire, will likely be a major talking point in the coming days.
We've spoken a lot on here about the political implications of a ceasefire hostage deal, including especially moving to the second phase. Has anything changed over the past week or so with regard to prospects within the Israeli Knesset and like at the tolerance level, let's say, especially in the wake of the tragedy of the Bibas family? Is that any impact on sort of the political considerations that are going on?
It's a great question. Look, as we talked about at the top, people's opinions have hardened. They've hardened, and you don't need to be Itamar Ben-Gvir, who I think tweeted out literally revenge late last week, to feel the urge to restart the war and to, quote unquote, destroy, annihilate Hamas. Again, we kind of glossed over it, but even if Israel restarts the war, and even if it's under President Donald Trump, it's not like Israel held a lot back, shall we say, in the first 15 months of this war. Now, there are various, quote unquote, new ideas. I don't know if they're that new with regard to what a resumption of the war will look like, especially under a new IDF general staff. So we have a new chief of staff of the IDF coming in next week, Eyal Zamir. And so it's expected that a lot of the top generals will also be moved around, and some will retire. So new U.S. president, new IDF general staff, what can be done? People like Bezalel Smotrich are calling for the complete reoccupation of the Gaza Strip. There are the people who want a renewed offensive into northern Gaza, including Gaza City. There are a lot of calls, and this gets back to your original point, Shanie, for a complete cutoff of humanitarian aid to the Gaza Strip if the ceasefire collapses. And again, thinking here in Israel is that you can, quote unquote, get away with it because you have Donald Trump in the White House and not a Democratic president, and so on and so forth. So you definitely have heard those calls. But again, Israel is still stuck in the strategic conundrum, which is that, yes, it's all well and good to want to go and destroy Hamas and unleash the hounds of hell of the IDF in the Gaza Strip, but you still have dozens of your fellow countrymen being held hostage there for precisely that reason, to forestall that scenario. And so you can't, this goes back to the very beginning of the war, but you still hear it from the prime minister on down. All the war goals, we're going to achieve all our war goals, right? That's what you consistently hear. We're going to get all the hostages back, and we're going to destroy Hamas. Well, show me how you can get both of those things done. Because I personally don't see how you can, what did I put it the other week? Grasp the stick at both ends. It's a nice soundbite, but in practical terms, you'll have to choose. And if it's not this weekend, then it'll be in a couple of weeks. Okay, we'll be right back after this brief message.
As Phase 1 of the ceasefire deal nears its expiration on March 1st and Israelis brace for the upcoming releases of living and deceased hostages, Israel Policy Forum continues to provide timely updates on the hostages' plight, the state of Phase 2 negotiations, and questions surrounding the future of Gaza. Be sure to follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Blue Sky to view our updated timeline tracking the progress of the hostage releases and for analysis on the war in Gaza and Israeli-Palestinian affairs more broadly. If you rely on Israel Policy Forum for credible, nuanced analysis, please make a gift today so that Israel Policy Forum's work can continue to have an impact. Donate now at ipf.li/supportthepod or at the Support the Show link in the show notes.
I think we should move now to the other side of our tiny strip of land in the West Bank, where Israel has deployed a few tanks there for the first time in, I think, 2 decades. I know you were in Jenin just a few weeks ago, which is definitely a hotbed for a lot of these types of issues. So tell us, what operations does the IDF have planned? How is it going to impact Palestinians living there? And does all of this impact the war in Gaza in any way?
So you're right. So, if the Gaza Strip wasn't enough, and in Lebanon, we should say that the ceasefire is still holding, and that the IDF withdrew to out of most of southern Lebanon that it was holding, save for 5 Israel calls strategic positions near the Israeli border, again, inside Lebanon, these kind of high ground vantage points across the Israel-Lebanon frontier. So there is still some IDF presence in southern Lebanon, but again, the withdrawal has mostly been accomplished, and the ceasefire still holds. And again, in Syria, the IDF is still on the Syrian side of the Golan Heights, still holding a buffer zone, and remains to be seen how long that is maintained. Although, according to Netanyahu and other senior officials, it will be indefinite. Okay, again, TBD. We then get to the West Bank, and the West Bank is increasingly a concern of mine, and it's increasingly a concern of many people who follow events here on the ground. So Israel, concurrently with the Gaza ceasefire on January, I think 19th, right? I think it came into effect the day before Trump was inaugurated, launched a renewed offensive in the northern West Bank into places like Jenin, Tulkarem, northern part of the Jordan Valley. So really that's been the focus of this major IDF operation for over a month now. And I went into Jenin, and really the Jenin refugee camp, with the IDF a little over a week ago. And that was, like you said, the epicenter of the IDF operation, because it has been the epicenter of terrorist and militant activity for quite some time. It's been this kind of ex-territory for years, where even the Palestinian Authority didn't want to go in, although listeners of this podcast know that there was a major PA security force operation there right up until the eve of the IDF operation. And when the IDF forces went in, literally they told the PA to leave. Like literally they moved in and the PA forces moved out. And so why am I saying all this by way of context? Number one, while there is a legitimate security rationale for an Israeli security operation in the northern West Bank, I think a lot of it was tied to political considerations in the Israeli cabinet. It's not a coincidence that it was launched right as Israel agreed to a ceasefire in Gaza. And number two, there was a PA security operation already ongoing in Jenin and in the refugee camp of Jenin for over a month before the IDF operation. And said this on the podcast before, it was the worst thing that you could have done for the PA, because you're burning them at both ends, right? They're going after gunmen and militants in the Jenin refugee camp at great personal cost and political cost to themselves and the standing of the PA, and then essentially Israel comes in and burns you on the other end. And so it makes the PA look like even greater collaborators with the Israelis than even they were before the IDF operation. But having said all that, yes, Israel not only has launched the operation, it's expanded the operation into other parts of the northern West Bank, into other refugee camps. And you're hearing this kind of rhetoric, both from Netanyahu and Defense Minister Israel Katz, that it's going to be a major focus for the coming year. And Israel Katz even said earlier this week that the residents of these refugee camps that have essentially been cleared out over the past month, they're not going to be allowed to return there for the rest of the year, and that the IDF itself would remain in the camps indefinitely for as long as it took. And I saw it firsthand in Jenin, in the camp. It's completely empty. 20,000 people gone. I think only a few hundred to 1,000 people maybe remain there, essentially potential kind of militants, terrorists, and gunmen, and people who just physically and financially can't leave. But the place is a ghost town, a destroyed ghost town. Roads, torn up. And again, the IDF is looking for explosive devices, kind of that the gunmen there hide underneath the asphalt. Fine, but houses blown up, schools, mosques also partially destroyed that I saw. So quite difficult and truly unprecedented in, like you said, almost 20 years, over 20 years in the West Bank. Now the tanks, that was a good PR tactic by Israel. It's kind of red meat to this government's right-wing base. The tanks, I think, are there for show. The bigger concern, I think, is the fact that this operation is not going to end anytime soon. It's expanding. It's a lot more heavy-handed and destructive than anything we've seen in the West Bank by Israel for over 20 years. And at a certain point, those 40,000 people who have been displaced from their homes, and potentially there could be more, that's going to become a burden on the rest of Palestinian society and the PA itself, and that could have wider implications for stability in the West Bank. So I'm deeply concerned, but I think this goes back to what we were talking about earlier, Shanie, right? Like the mood here is not one of compromise, especially when you have this type of Israeli government, and so not that the West Bank is kind of flying under the radar, but it's almost on autopilot, and there's no real kind of national debate over the ramifications and implications of this kind of operation, especially since the West Bank, relatively speaking, and definitely relative to Gaza and other fronts, has been the quietest front for Israel over the past year and a half, and really over the past decade plus. And so you're almost squandering it all. For what? Unclear. You're undermining the PA itself, which is also a concern, but definitely not to this Israeli government, who sees the PA as an enemy. And then final point, it's also a testament to the weakness, I'd say, of the IDF currently, and the top brass of the IDF, who for years were trying to kind of hold back the baser and more militant instincts of various right-wing Israeli governments, and they've counseled a more restrained, professional, realistic approach to the West Bank. I think that's gone out the window.
Yeah. Well, here's hoping things don't just get worse before they get better, right? As they tend to here.
Yeah. Look. No. I mean, look. We have had some good news. The ceasefire in Gaza, at least the first stage, wasn't a given, and the fact that we've now had 29 Israelis, 25 of whom came out alive, released from Gaza, also not a given, and hopefully we'll have a few more families who get their loved ones back in the coming days. And depending on the decisions made by Hamas, you could see an extension of the ceasefire and to get more hostages back. So I think all of that is positive news. There's obviously a lot of room for concern, and that's even before we get into the fun, and it's not fun at all, trust me, Shanie, of domestic Israeli politics and what we're seeing on the issues like the judicial overhaul. This is kind of inside baseball, but you still have senior Israeli government ministers whose sole focus, when you have funerals of hostages and potential hostages that may or may not come home, and just everything else going on here, you know what they're concerned about? You know what their number one priority is? Nominating their friends and Likud apparatchiks and central committee members to various kind of corporate boards and public companies. That's what they're focused on. Or going after the media, or going after the attorney general, and so on and so forth. It's unbelievable almost, but it is believable because it's actually happening. And so this is kind of also part of the bipolar reality of life here in Israel, where you have, I mean, if we're going to get into it, the funeral of Oded Lifshitz earlier today, and again we're recording this on Tuesday. It's a remarkable, almost document of an old Israel, right? So Oded Lifshitz was, like I said, 84 years old, a former journalist, by the way, but also a farmer. Obviously a kibbutznik, so a hard and fast socialist, who also was in the Nachal and paratrooper brigades and fought in at least 3 or 4 Israeli wars. And so this kind of person, this kind of individual, exists in Israel, but used to exist a lot more. And he was also a peace activist. So he lived on the frontier of the Gaza Strip, and obviously, served in the IDF, but he campaigned very publicly and very strongly for coexistence and for peace between the two peoples. And it's become a cliche, but it's important to stress. Up until a few weeks before October 7th, he was still driving sick Palestinian children to hospitals inside Israel. And so his wife, Yocheved, who was also taken hostage and released, thankfully, early on in the war, she said in the eulogy, it was a great betrayal by our neighbors in Gaza, who we tried to help. It was a great betrayal by them that they kidnapped and murdered my husband, Oded Lifshitz. And so
one of many such stories.
Yeah, Vivian Zilber as well, burnt alive in her home in the Gaza envelope. Also a very prominent peace activist. And so this individual used to be a lot more common in Israel. And, you saw the family and his kids and grandkids and how they spoke. They weren't calling for revenge. They were calling for accountability, definitely. And also the return of their love, of their neighbors in many respects, in Neri and the other hostages, and also to continue working for peace. And so I saw the eulogies and the funeral as this document of an old Israel and hopefully a future Israel, but tinged with sadness given our current realities that it may be a dying Israel if it hasn't already died already, and not just because Oded Lifshitz was being put in the ground and buried there in Neri that he so loved. And so I'm generally despite being a journalist, I'm tend to still remain hopeful. But that thought definitely crossed my mind, that with that specific generation and maybe the generation after growing older, what does the future hold for Israel? And I urge, by the way, everyone to check out the eulogies and watch that ceremony, because it was quite touching to see it. Really kind of a throwback to the Israel of yesteryear.
Yeah, well, we're grateful for the families who at least have some closure now after many, many, many months of waiting anxiously, and hopefully we will have closure in the return of more living hostages very soon.
We can only hope for the best, Shanie. And I'm very curious, how does all this look from your neck of the woods? Not only the hostage returns, but just potential ceasefire, the U.S. role. By the way, I forgot to even touch on the U.S. role, but I'm curious, what's your sense?
I think the U.S. is very eager to have some kind of second phase. I don't know if it'll look like what was actually agreed upon, but they're quite eager to solve this problem, whatever solving means, right, in this context. And I think there are a lot of sort of wacky or unconventional ideas floating around, but that doesn't mean that none of them will work, and doesn't mean that none of them will not be attempted and fail as well. But there's definitely a desire to finish this war one way or another on the U.S. side, and that's surely how I feel as well. In terms of the sentiment around the Jewish community, I think in the wake of the Bibas family in particular, their tragedy seemed to have really radicalized a lot of people, if I'm being honest. It felt a lot like October 8th, where people were having a very emotional gut reaction that was maybe even violent in how they were feeling, given how extreme what we heard and saw was. And so, I'm hoping that this is sort of temporary, as many of these feelings tend to be. But I think it's very similar to what you're seeing in Israel. I think there's almost no discrepancy between what the Jewish community here is feeling broadly and what those on the ground in Israel are feeling. Maybe a little bit of distance, I suppose, but I would say very similar. And, I think we had some calls from the Bibas family that what they want is return, not revenge, right? Mm-hmm. And so I'm hoping that we can try to embody that when we think about this and honor the wishes of many of the hostage families who say the focus needs to be on returning more Israelis back to their homes above all else.
Absolutely. That's what they're calling for. And I think that's the appropriate call. Again, that kind of inherent contradiction that's been with us from the beginning of the war, and these contradictory war goals that officials, and not even just officials, but other people here just don't seem to see the contradiction, how you achieve both of them. Quite concerning. But I agree, Shanie, that it's, from the U.S. point of view, I think they'd love for this to be concluded, and especially to get the hostages out. I'm just not convinced that and by there I mean the new Trump administration officials, they're being as realistic as they likely should be. And by what I mean by that is they say, well, all the hostages have to come home and we have to get rid of Hamas. It's like, okay, everyone can sign up for that. Right?
Which one comes first?
Yeah. Which one comes first, and how do you achieve both those goals? And then when you get into the actual detail, it's like, well, Hamas has to, depending on the day and depending on the official, well, Hamas can't be part of any future governing entity for Gaza. Okay, fine. Hamas has already acquiesced or relented on ruling Gaza politically in the future, but it's not willing to leave Gaza. It's not willing to lay down its arms. It'll still be in the background there, exerting a lot of influence. And so, okay, what do you mean when you say no more Hamas, or Hamas can't be part of any future Gaza arrangement? Okay, and then, well, we all want the hostages home. It's like, fine, but it's not the U.S., it's Israel, needs to pay a price, because as we were mentioning earlier, it's the only insurance policy Hamas has. And so I wish the public debate would be a bit more realistic. And I'll caveat all that by saying, I think two things. Number one, I think Trump himself and his people are playing power poker, as it were. That they're trying to exert as much pressure all the time, not only on Hamas, but on the Arab states and the Arab mediators, to see what's possible, right? And in that, I think they're walking hand in hand with Israel. And so Israel, again, without agreeing to completely end the war, is going to sense and find out what is possible to get out of Hamas, and to see if you can soften Hamas's position, at least in the coming weeks. So I think it's all part of that, as someone once coined, the art of the deal. I forget who coined that phrase, but it's a good one. So I think that's part of the art of the deal and the art of the negotiation in this very high stakes negotiation. Sure. And then number two, I'm not entirely convinced that Trump himself will be opposed to Israel restarting the war, if they can blame Hamas for it. That if actual stage 2 negotiations don't succeed, and again, it could be a matter of days or a matter of weeks, I think Trump could be convinced that the only resort and the only way to gain more leverage on Hamas is through military means. And I think from Trump's point of view, he's like, well, I got the deal for the first stage of the ceasefire that Biden couldn't get. I got a whole bunch of hostages out. And as one person put it to me, he'll look at it and say, as he said publicly in the past, it's their problem. It's their problem. It's not my problem. It's not America's problem. It's their problem. And by their, he means the Israelis and the Arabs. We'll see. We'll see what he ultimately chooses, because if he doesn't want the war to restart, then Netanyahu will not be able to restart the war. But if he gets in an orange light and definitely a green light, then he may allow it.
It does look like the U.S. Middle East envoy might be delayed, but is planning to head to the region quite soon, with certainly this top of mind for him.
So that's another interesting point, that Steve Witkoff, Trump's Middle East envoy, by all accounts, a very capable person, and a very, how should we put this? Not only capable, but also he does connect personally with people, and I've heard that from several people that have dealt with him in the last few weeks, since he came into post, and even before he came into post, because he was definitely involved during the Biden transition. He himself said this past weekend that he was likely going to arrive in the region, including in Israel, on Wednesday, tomorrow, and then that has been delayed. So if people were very eager and felt the urgency of the moment to get stage 2 completed, I don't think the U.S. Middle East envoy would kind of delay his arrival in the region to try to get that done and to hammer out an agreement. I think it's look, I can't speak for the U.S. Maybe he has other scheduling conflicts. He's also trying to broker peace, or at least a ceasefire in Ukraine. But it's, I think, a leverage play by Israel and the U.S. to put the onus on Hamas and the Arab states to extend phase 1 and say, look, time's up. Stage 1 is literally about to end. There's no stage 2 agreement. If you don't want the IDF tanks to start rolling into Bet Lahia and Bet Hanun and other parts of definitely northern Gaza, let's extend this for a few more weeks. Hamas just needs to release a few more hostages every week, and we'll see what we can do. I think it's part of the negotiating play. But we'll find out.
See if those Arab states are up to the task.
Yeah, I mean, the last thing they probably want is a renewal of the Gaza war, again, in a very, very real and heavy way, played out every night on the screens all across the Middle East during Ramadan. I think that will alarm them, definitely. But we'll find out. We'll be a lot smarter next time we talk, Shanie.
As you know, and as you always say, our listeners are smarter than we are. So hopefully they'll have more updates tomorrow.
They're definitely smarter than we are. And, well, let's hope that whether there's an actual stage 2 or a phase 1 plus, or call it whatever you want, that more Israeli hostages are or continue to be released in the coming weeks. Let's hope for that.
Amen. Bye, Neri.
Take care, Shanie.